So the talk today is trying to bring Nishida's concept of Basho into relation or into an encounter with Laruelle's one within the framework of immanence. And the kind of mediator here will be a recent study of Nishida's philosophy by Higaki Tatsuya, that reads Nishida in terms of Deleuze. So I'm hoping that that serves as a kind of relatively concrete scholarly framework to deal with two very momentous and sort of continent-sized theoretical projects. So the talk itself has basically three sections. I just want to introduce the framework of immanence as a way to bring Nishida and Laruelle into an encounter, address Higaki's Deleuzian reading of Nishida, and then try to introduce a very early account of Laruelle of the relationship of non-philosophy to the one. Really, the book that is really the first expression of Laruelle's non-philosophy, which is the minority principle, principe de minorité, and the notion that he derives of dispersive multiplicities, and then try to use this to generate some conclusions. But first, I'd like to begin just by thanking Temple University, Japan, and also Endicott for giving me a sabbatical to work on this, to thank Anne Francoise and the other speakers, to thank Jordanco for really pulling this together, and also the Nanzan Institute for Religion and Culture in Nagoya. They were very generous in offering me a research fellowship this year, and I would recommend to all of you, don't take a research fellowship in a foreign country in the year of a pandemic. It won't work very well. And so I'm hoping that there will be the opportunity to actually participate at the Institute, maybe at a future time. And then finally, I wanted to thank, I've never met her, but I've really been working in trying to understand Nishida by way of the translations of Jacinthe Tremblay. The main works, especially from the middle period of Nishida, have not been translated into English, and she's translated those three main books into French. And so that's been my main source of Nishida's thought for that middle period. So first section, thinking about immanence as a kind of commonplace for Nishida and Laruelle. And of course, using the Western term immanence to analyze Nishida is somewhat problematic, but we can kind of set that to one side. I think it's fair to note that something like immanence as a common method and object, both a way of doing philosophy and a way of thinking about the materials of philosophy, is something that cuts across the three main phases of Nishida's career. The initial phase with a focus on pure experience, drawing on William James in particular, with inquiry into the good and intuition and reflection in self-consciousness. And then this middle period is, I think, what I'd like to focus on most, where he develops this predicate logic of Basho, or place, and relates this in one of his essays to a very important distinction between these three worlds, these kind of three successive enlargements of Basho, or deepenings of Basho: the world of nature, which is included then in the Basho, the world of consciousness, and then finally this postulation of the intelligible world. And then finally, the third period, where Nishida develops the notion of an absolutely contradictory identity as the logic of world and history. And one of the things I'll be concerned with is Higaki's reading of the kind of shift from the second period to the third. and to what extent that shift marks a break or a deepening or the relationship between those two phases. But the point here is that all three of these phases, the entire career of Nishida, I think can be understood from the standpoint of the problem of immanence, the coordination of both method and object, to think about the world and experience as immanent, at least in the sense that it is not dependent on something like ontotheology. It's very clear that Nishida is not positing some sort of transcendent being that would be the ultimate orientation or the ultimate ground of the world or the ground of experience. Now, in Laruelle, it's clear that immanence is perhaps the most important guiding thread of his non-philosophy and non-standard philosophy. So on the one hand, non-philosophical immanence coordinated with the one or the real is understood to be separate from the philosophical duality of immanence and transcendence, which Laruelle would associate with being. So rather than a kind of opposition of immanence to transcendence, Laruelle wants to conceive of immanence as separate from the duality that philosophy sets up between immanence and transcendence. Immanence is capable of supporting, with respect to a thought according to the real, an indifference to the philosophical introduction of transcendence as opposed to immanence. So we can think of transcendence as opposed to immanence, or we can think of a mode of immanence in which the immanence transcendence difference is indifferent. I think the notion of immanence is also realized in Laruelle's work in the syntax of not just the one, but the notion that the one must be thought in one. It is not just a matter of the generic human or man, but man in man. And in general, the syntax that Laruelle uses of ex en personne, in person, which also has the flavor in the French of a kind of negation, right? That personne in French can be with ne, can mean no one. Personne ne connaît, no one knows. And so there's a slight echo when we say ex en personne is both ex in person, present, but also ex generically present, present in no one in particular. And so immanence, the one in the one, is not a specification of the one, but rather one without one, man without man. And then finally, it's very important in Laruelle's thought that there's a distinction between absolute and radical immanence. This is closely related to the first point about the difference between immanence thought according to the one and immanence thought according to philosophy. Absolute immanence might be something like Spinozist substance. It's absolutely immanent, which means it's opposed to transcendence, whereas radical immanence is a practice of thought such that immanence is not attributed ontologically to a kind of thesis. It is instead a way of understanding what is determined only in the last instance. So what do these two relationships to immanence have in common? I think for both Nishida and Laruelle, immanence is not simply opposed to transcendence. I wouldn't want to equate the way that Nishida and Laruelle do this. I think they're doing this in very different ways, but in both cases, they aren't choosing immanence as against a thesis of transcendence. And that's why for Nishida, it's very important that immanence is also sokuhi transcendence, right? It both is and is not its opposite. And so there's at the very least a complication. It's not a matter of simply siding with immanence against transcendence, but of finding some kind of more complicated or more nuanced structure. But at the same time, I think for neither thinker is immanence conceived of in terms of some kind of coincidence of opposites. in the sense of the synthesis of two terms. And for both philosophers, I think it's important to recognize the role of Kant. Both Nishida and Laruelle are strongly influenced by Kant, but both of them, I think, ultimately reject the Kantian transcendental solution. So that, Kant gives us, in the unity of apperception, a wonderful way of thinking of the synthesis of concept and experience, right? And I think Nishida and Laruelle want to think of immanence not in terms of a synthesis of two opposed terms, but as something that is primary or prior to differentiation or prior to the opposite. And in this way, I think both thinkers reject the idea that immanence would be a kind of mediation. And then finally, for both Nishida and Laruelle, there are no black cows at midnight. In other words, both thinkers reject the solution that would take immanence as a kind of magic term that would simply reject all differentiation and plunge us into some kind of mysticism. Both thinkers are very interested in the phenomena of mysticism and the thought of mysticism, but for neither philosopher is mysticism sufficient for thought. We need both philosophers, both thinkers are trying to think immanence in a rigorous way, not in a way that would simply eliminate the problem or give up on the problem. I think for both thinkers, that kind of solution would be a simple immediacy, a simple rejection of mediation, so that immanence and transcendence would ultimately be the same or simply substitutable. And so I think the upshot would be that I think both Nishida and Laruelle want to look for a new kind of logic or a new kind of syntax for thought that will allow this more complicated or more nuanced form of immanence to be realized. So the aim of the paper is twofold. First, as I indicated, I'd like to respond, at least to some degree, from a Laruellian standpoint to Higaki Tatsuya's interpretation of Nishida in terms of Deleuze's philosophy of life, and in particular, his analysis of the role of Tanabe's criticism of Nishida, which is, I think, a kind of standard problem in Nishida scholarship, that this is a kind of crux in Nishida's own development, and that there's a lot of thought about the role of Tanabe and his criticism of his teacher. And then secondly, I'd like to show the possible relevance of Laruelle's non-philosophy to the problem of how Nishida himself goes about philosophizing. Not so much the content of what he's saying, but how does he do what he does when he thinks in his particular mode. And with respect to the second problem, I'd actually like to begin with an observation by Nishitani Keiji, another student of Nishida, who I think makes a kind of remarkable observation about his teacher. He writes, Nishida's philosophy begins from a standpoint of acting intuition. It is based on the collapse of the standpoint of the conscious or reflective ego that informs our ordinary notions of the self. This is a standpoint of radical realism, according to which we think a thing by becoming it and do a thing by becoming it. And I've added the italics here of begins and radical realism, because I wanted to emphasize that I think Nishitani's point here is that Nishida doesn't give us a theory of how one could begin from this philosophical point of view. He plunges in. He presumes from the outset that a standpoint of acting intuition is possible, and he simply realizes that standpoint. And so this position of radical realism, from Nishitani's point of view, is not a thesis that Nishida proposes, but a posture that he takes right from the very beginning, such that he then elaborates the consequences of that standpoint. So it's a radical realism, not as the conclusion of an argument, but as the starting point for a certain mode of philosophizing. And I think Nishitani wants to say that this is, in a sense, making the task too easy, that this is a criticism of Nishida that I think he wants to share with Tanabe. Both of them are saying this doesn't problematize the starting point of philosophy sufficiently. Nishitani goes on and says, Nishida does little philosophizing about philosophizing itself. If this beginning standpoint where one has already broken through the conscious self or the dualistic self, if it weren't just presupposed, but had to be problematized, then one would have to think about philosophy more. And Nishitani says, well, Nishida philosophized from a position where the conscious self had already been broken through, where one engaged in philosophy by identifying with philosophizing. I think a kind of extraordinary formulation. One engages in philosophy by identifying with the act of philosophizing. One sort of plunges in with both feet rather than trying to establish the conditions of possibility for philosophizing before doing so. So this observation by Nishitani, I think, gives us a kind of insight into how Nishida goes about thinking. So the main focus here to kind of mediate these two thinkers is a recent book by Higaki Tatsuya, Nishida Kitaro's Philosophy of Life. And essentially, what Higaki does is he reads Nishida's project in terms of Deleuze, and especially Deleuze's appropriation of Bergson, but also his critique of Bergson and the kind of unity or continuity of intuition in Bergson. So Higaki wants to give a very kind of positive reading of Nishida as appropriate, as anticipating the kind of notion of life as difference that we find in Deleuze. And I can't, of course, deal with the entire argumentative structure of the book, which I think is a wonderful book. But Higaki's argument depends upon a kind of break between the logic of Basho in the second period of Nishida and the final period, the last decade roughly of Nishida's career, in which he proposes the notion of absolute contradictory self-identity as the kind of logic of world and especially history. So Higaki's point is that we can note in the late period of Nishida a kind of turn to activity and poiesis, a kind of production, a self-production of the world that is absent or suppressed in the period where the logic of Basho is prevalent. And in this kind of shift from Basho to absolute contradictory self-identity, Higaki emphasizes the role of Tanabe's criticism. So I turn to that now. This is, I think, again, a well-recognized element in Nishida's development, and also just an important aspect of the development of the Kyoto School. That the relationship between Tanabe and Nishida was a kind of fraught one. There was, I think, a certain amount of both theoretical and personal tension, and it's very interesting to think about this relationship and the way that the relationship is expressed in the thought of both philosophers. So in the 1930 essay request for Professor Nishida's guidance, Tanabe effectively accuses Nishida of remaining too much of a kind of Neoplatonic, Plotinian mystic. He says, it seems inevitable to me that by the self-awareness of absolute nothingness, the the kind of foundation of Nishida's thought, the universals at every stage, so in this kind of these levels of Basho, or increasingly vast, encompassing worlds, as well as the places within which those universals are, will be noetically transformed into the self. Furthermore, everything will become a shadow, enveloped in the light of calm contemplation and resignation, so that raw reality and action will completely lose their original meaning. And as understood by Higaki, this criticism really went to the heart of Nishida's project. And in Tanabe's, in Higaki's reading, Nishida develops that third and final phase of his thought in response to Tanabe, and he emphasizes self-conscious activity as this kind of production that is immanent to world and history, the absolutely contradictory self-identity, which is this kind of constant generation and destruction of life and the historical world. And Higaki, I think, gives a kind of tour de force reading where he lines up the three periods of Nishida's work with the three syntheses of time from Deleuze's difference and repetition. And in particular, he says that final phase of action and poiesis is closely aligned with Deleuze's third synthesis of time, time out of joint, which is this kind of associated with the death drive and thanatos. So it's the kind of the futural dimension or ecstasis of time, in which you have a kind of death in life and life in death. And I think I'd like to point out something like an irony here, because I think I really appreciate Higaki's argument overall, but there's an interesting irony that Deleuze himself is haunted by the same kind of criticism that Tanabe brings to bear on Nishida. There's a kind of controversial book by Alain Badiou, Deleuze, The Clamor of Being, where he essentially accuses Deleuze of a kind of Platinian Neoplatonism, exactly the same criticism that Tanabe brings to bear on Nishida. And Badiou writes about Deleuze, I'd readily state that whereas my aim is to found a Platonism of the multiple, Deleuze's concern was with a Platonism of the virtual. Deleuze retains from Plato the univocal sovereignty of the one, but sacrifices the determination of the idea as always actual. For him, the idea is the virtual totality. The one is the infinite reservoir of dissimilar productions. And in the passage just subsequent to this quote, interestingly, Badiou points out that from his point of view, Deleuze is a kind of transcendent-based Neoplatonist, whereas from Deleuze's point of view, Badiou, embracing Platonism, has failed to embrace immanence. And I think this is a very important point, especially as we turn to Laruelle. Badiou himself recognizes in this work that there might be no clear way to determine the difference between immanence and transcendence. In the case of Badiou and Deleuze, from Badiou's point of view, philosophically, Deleuze looks like transcendence, whereas Badiou appropriates the immanence of set theory, whereas from Deleuze's point of view, he's the immanent one, developing this kind of differential philosophy of life, and Badiou remains transcendent. So immanence becomes this kind of prize over which the philosophers are fighting, and it doesn't seem as if there are independent criteria that would enable us to distinguish the real immanence from the mere accusation or claim to immanence within a certain form of philosophy. So in turning then to Laruelle, I'd like to focus on his early work, Principe de Minorité, because I think there's a relatively simple and straightforward formulation of the kind of immanence that will be developed in non-philosophy. Now, that's not to call Minority Principle a simple or straightforward book. I think it's actually one of the most complexly argued books of Laruelle, but because it's in some sense the breakthrough of non-philosophy, the first full-length book in which Laruelle is doing non-philosophy rather than the earlier stage of a kind of Nietzschean, Heideggerian synthetic philosophy, it gives us, I think, in a relatively clear mode, the main point of Laruelle's turn to the one. And in this book, and of course we can't deal with really any of the details of the book as a whole, but just to pull out one important concept, one important formulation from the text, Laruelle distinguishes 3 levels of philosophical cut, kupu, which is a very important term coming out of Deleuze. And he wants to say, well, there are 2 philosophical levels of cut. And what Laruelle wants to do is introduce this 3rd level, as he puts it, it's a level that is not a level. So it's a kind of non-third. And the 2 philosophical levels of cut are ways of cutting the real, or conceiving of a cut that is immanent to the real. The first is the traditional or classic cut of real from ideal, reality and ideality, right? And this would be the traditional notion going back at least to Plato, but also being realized in a modern mode with, say, Kant, right? And the clear division or cut between the thing in itself and the legislation of concepts over experience in the mind or in the worldly experience. And the important thing here is that we have a distinction between 2 sides in which the relationship is constitutive of each of the 2 terms. The real is that which can be idealized, right? And the ideal is that which expresses the real or can be manifest in the real. And of course, there are many ways that this can be manifest or instantiated, but this would be the kind of classical duality structure of philosophy. And Laruelle wants to recognize that something importantly different takes place in Nietzsche. Right? That Nietzsche is a radical thinker within the Western tradition because he introduces a form of cut or a form of distinction that is not the same as that of Plato or Kant. And I think Deleuze maybe points out that, well, maybe this distinction of Nietzsche can also be found in the Stoics, in the Stoic lecta. So it's not that Nietzsche invents it, but it's a different kind of a minoritarian form of difference or form of distinction. And this is the distinction between real and sense, or cut between real and sense. And I think in Deleuze, we see this clearly as the distinction between the corporeal and the incorporeal sense of bodies. These are not 2 different things, neither are they the distinction between ideality and reality, but a kind of image layer that is present as the reality of bodies, right? Or in Nietzsche, if you think about the relationality of active and passive affects, active and passive forces, those forces are the relational expression of the beings themselves. So that being and beings are not divided, but beings are expressive of the active and reactive forces of being. So this is a kind of immanent difference. And Laruelle, I think, wants to give credit to Nietzsche and Deleuze in thinking a mode of immanent difference that's not just a repetition of the difference between the real and the ideal. It really is a different kind of cut, but it still is a philosophical cut. It still is a kind of interpretation of the real. In particular, it's a different interpretation than that of Plato and Kant. There's a real difference philosophically between Nietzsche and Plato, Deleuze and Kant. What Laruelle wants to introduce is a third cut, which he characterizes as a supplément de coupure. It's not a cut, but a cut supplement. And I think it's a wonderful formulation here. If you think of the cut as something like a Dedekind cut, just a separation maybe of two intervals in a set. And this is a kind of addition to the cut. So you think of the cut not as dividing things, but actually as adding something. It's a cut that is an addition, but it's an addition of cutting. It's not plugging a third thing in, but it is adding a cut in the cut. And this is precisely the notion of unilateral duality, which becomes, I think, the governing logic of Laruelle's thought. And I've pictured it here as it's the relationship or the cut of real without there being another term. And so this is the cut that every philosophical cut itself already is. And to see or to experience from the standpoint of this cut that never stops being a cut is to see according to what Laruelle will later call vision in one. So this is a mode of thinking, not a way of thinking the real, but simply thinking the real. Well, Laruelle himself describes this as a kind of essence, but it is a non-ideal essence. It's neither a factual relation instantiated in the world, nor some kind of differential relation of relation or variation of variation, as in Nietzsche. It's an essence freed from reflexivity. It's an irreflexive cut. And if we think in terms of this irreflexive cut, we think of the essence in terms of dispersive a prioris. The a priori, the transcendental, is no longer governing something. It is the source of a kind of infinite dispersion or atomization. So what are the upshots then from Laruelle's notion of unilateral difference? Well, this third cut doesn't compete with Deleuze or Plato, nor is it even philosophically distinguishable from these two types of cut. At the end of the day, only non-philosophy would recognize this third cut as meaningful. From a philosophical point of view, it becomes a kind of inert or tautological, meaningless statement. Maybe something like when Nishida says that identity is absolutely self-contradictory. Well, if we try to analyze that from the standpoint maybe of standard Anglophone analytic philosophy, most philosophers, well, that's meaningless. To say something is absolutely self-contradictory is just a kind of babbling. And so the question is, what kind of syntax might be philosophically meaningless and yet have its own sense, its own meaning, independently of philosophy? Secondly, when thought from the standpoint of the irreflexive one or the real, even though that standpoint doesn't compete with the two other kinds of cut, the difference between those two kinds of cut becomes itself indifferent or uncontested. There's no reason to choose between Plato and Deleuze. The Deleuzian cut just is the Deleuzian cut, and the Platonic cut just is the Platonic cut each time that it is instantiated or each time it is realized. And so even though the third cut doesn't compete with the other two, it is a standpoint from which the other two no longer need to compete with one another. And then in particular, to come back to Higaki and his reading of Nishida, Laruelle's thought does not imply a rejection of the Nietzschean Deleuzian cut. It's not rejecting the notion of immanent difference. It only suspends the idea that this conception would be ultimate or sufficient for thought. So this can only be a very, very tentative conclusion. Conclusion probably isn't the right word, but kind of suggestion. The first suggestion would be that this type of immanence, the unilateral duality introduced by Laruelle, suggests a non-dialectical and non-decisional kind of solution to the problem of the relation in Nishida between the role of the intelligible world in the Basho period, precisely the aspect of Nishida's thought that Tanabe criticizes as Neoplatonic, and the social historical world of production from the later period. In other words, the kind of immanence proposed by Laruelle allows us to see the period of Basho and the later period as different, and yet not necessarily in competition with one another. And we don't need to posit a kind of advancement in Nishida's thought, as if the third period overcame some kind of limitation that was present in the second period. The second period can be within its own relative autonomy, simply as self-consistent as the third period. And then finally, I think this is maybe a more interesting conclusion or suggestion, that Laruelle's non-philosophy can help to provide an account of exactly the method of philosophizing that Nishitani recognized in his teacher. That the idea that Nishida philosophizes by simply identifying with philosophizing, by sort of jumping in with both feet. That it might be not so much in what Nishida says, but in the way he philosophizes in a kind of naive mode, or in a kind of non-self-conscious mode, that makes him something like a non-philosopher. In further work, I'm hoping to develop some of these ideas, especially in terms of the kinds of formalizations that we see in the later Nishida and also in Laruelle, and especially the interplay of algebraic and geometrical representations. It's fascinating that Nishida, in I believe it was the 1930s, developed a kind of philosophy of mathematics that would be grounded in groups rather than sets. So we saw group theory, which is the kind of study of symmetries, symmetric operations. And so he was thinking of this formalization in mathematics that I think is closely linked to his own work. And there might be, I think, places where there would be further connections to develop between his work and Laruelle's. Thanks for listening. Arigato gozaimashita. And yeah, I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rocco, for this really detailed and insightful presentation. So hope you're not too tired. We've had a long day.
It's still morning. It's only 8:30.
Yeah, 10:30 p.m. here in Tokyo. So probably people here are already sleepy, but yeah, I think we can have a good round of Q&A as far as you can take it, because there's nothing scheduled after this. So the floor is open. Please go ahead and give your comments and questions. Go ahead, Mahbub. I'm sorry, you're not, your mic, yeah.
Be able to hear me now. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rocco. I really appreciate the presentation. My question is a little bit complicated. I haven't quite formulated it in my mind, so bear with me. I wanted to go back to one of your initial points that you made regarding radical realism and the way Nishida actually jumps into philosophizing rather than talking about and wondering what philosophy is and coming up with grounds of it. And the latter point that you made, which is really very beautiful, the idea that from the point of view of this third non-cut, the other two cuts of, say, Plato and Deleuze are in a radical sense indifferent. And so the way I would like to kind of bring the two things together is that is it the case that from the point of view of the posture of the one, so the posture of the third cut, the other two, if you like, represent cuts that are made in the performance of philosophizing? So it's a little bit like, not to draw the analogy with mathematics, it's not the description of a mathematical theorem after the theorem has been posited, or the injunction has been made, or a field has been extended, from the reals to the complex. It's the very introduction of those extensions in the process of examining a mathematical problem. So this brings in, I think, the dimension of a kind of a radical practice. That in one sense, what we are doing right now is still talking after the fact. So there's an inevitable philosophizing that work to be able to genuinely engage in a kind of a practical non-philosophy. We would have to be dealing with these problems ourselves, and so perhaps as a kind of an event, the conference itself is that kind of practice.
Yes, yeah. Thanks very much. And this, I think, links back to Jordanco's talk as well, very, very clearly. And I think that Jordanco, in his book on non-philosophy, does a wonderful job of showing how it's exactly this kind of practical dimension, which is I think the key to really understanding Laruelle's non-philosophy, is to see that the turn or conversion is not a theoretical one, but a kind of half turn or quarter turn from a thesis or a claim to the claiming of the claim. So that non-philosophy doesn't introduce a second claim over against those of philosophy, but only introduces a new kind of claiming that is only a practice or only a mode of action, active thinking. That's what makes it axiomatic, is the axiom has no content in itself. It only exists to the extent that downstream consequences flow from it. So it's a kind of only practice. And I think this is what Jordanco captures with the Japanese concept of kata. Kata is not the conception of a practice. It's the immanence of being in the midst of this kind of inhabitation, right? And it's closely linked, I think, to Ravesson and to Peirce and to the kind of pragmatic tradition that wants to find in thought not representable contents, but modes of creative construction. And I think another link here would be to the second period of Wittgenstein, that the language games of the second Wittgenstein are very difficult, I think, to genuinely comprehend. It's really easy to just say, oh, it's people moving slabs around or calling out for a certain practice. But what Wittgenstein, I think, is at pains to get at is the inevitable inhabitation of these language games, even as we try to examine them, right? That we are always one level behind ourselves, right? We are always doing something that we don't actually realize. And no matter how self-reflective we are, right? Reflexivity is not a way of figuring out the essence of practice. The essence of practice is discovered inside practice. And this is a common theme in philosophy. And of course, this is something that maybe Fichte was trying to get at, to begin from practice or to begin from act. But I think what non-philosophy does is shift that ground. Instead of thinking of that beginning as a new thesis that can be proposed, to say that we begin from the act, it's to recognize once and for all the sheer foreclosure of our powers of representation to those practices. And And I think you're right that the mathematical example is a really wonderful one. There's a kind of there's a mathematically unrepresentable experience that is the invention of mathematics. That mathematics is nothing but its own invention, and yet mathematics, for all of its reflexivity and representational power, cannot capture that moment in which mathematics invents itself. And I'm not sure if that might have veered away from your question, but
that was very helpful. Just one final point I was going to make as an addendum to that is it also the case that through that practice, radical practice, what is claims that are made within philosophy are actually shown to be exactly that, claims.
Right, and that there's no the claiming of the claim becomes something identical in the last instance. That it's not a matter of saying that all philosophies are the same, but neither is it trying to envelop them in some kind of disjunctive synthesis, as if they are all expressions of philosophy. It's just that each one is its own mode of claiming its philosophy.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, it looks like Stanimir.
Just let me get my video straight. If there's no other questions, I can proceed, I guess. Can you?
Yes, please do. I think your hand is the only one up.
Right. Thank you for the wonderful talk. Can you elaborate a bit more on the points that you made on how Nishitani critiqued Nishida in terms of Nishida resembling this kind of Plotinian, almost like Plotinian thinker, right? I mean, I'm not an expert in Japanese philosophy, and one of the reasons why I wanted to be part of this conference is also get more knowledge. But what strikes me as surprising in this criticism, without having the knowledge that you have, is that presumably, I'm just wondering from, I mean, other than elaborating on the point, I'm just wondering whether you can also say what is the sort of non-Plotinian perspective of Nishitani's critique. I mean, in other words, I mean, there are of course plenty of differences between Plato and Plotinus, but what will be then the difference between Nishitani and Nishida?
Great, thanks. And just to, so I had cited Nishitani talking about Nishida, but the criticism is that of Tanabe Hajime, who is another student of Nishida. But I think that Nishitani, at the end of the day, shares Tanabe's criticism. He just thinks that the criticism was in a certain sense mistaken, that it was unfair with respect to the content of Nishida's philosophy, that it was a kind of cheap shot. Tanabe in another piece talks about it. It's a non-dialectical affirmation of dialectics, and Nishitani defends Nishida from this charge by saying, well, but it's a little bit unfair if you really look at Nishida's notion of dialectics and dialectical nothingness. It's not somehow equivalent to being. It is a kind of mediation or self-mediating of the difference between being and nothingness. But again, just as the difference between Badiou and Deleuze, it does seem that at a certain point, philosophers reach a point where they're just kind of talking past one another, especially when they reach a critical mode. As soon as one philosopher points to another and says, you are too X, you are too Platonic, you are too Kantian, it's more of just a smear, right? Because there's always a way to defend, every philosopher worth their salt has a sophisticated enough conception that a cheap shot objection fails. And so Nishitani kind of defends his teacher, but he also says, yeah, but at the end of the day, Tanabe was sort of right in the sense that Nishida didn't give sufficient attention to the very problem of philosophizing. And in Tanabe, there is a kind of a very strong notion of conversion, which is this recognition of I'm not sure if this is the right way, something like the sinful nature of the self, the ego as a kind of evil that has to be broken through from the outside by something transcendent, something like other power. And so it's very similar in some respects to Levinas. There's a kind of insufficiency of the self to accomplish any kind of openness to truth without the demand, the call of the other, or the work of the other in Tanabe. And so what I think is what's fascinating as almost a kind of crisscrossing of the two thinkers is Tanabe accuses Nishida of starting from a religious standpoint, that he is like Plotinus, thinking of the one, or thinking of absolute nothingness as a kind of faith, an object that one begins from by just believing in it. So he's saying that this is not philosophy, this is religion. But interestingly, Tanabe, starting from philosophy, ends up going in the direction where he says philosophy fails on its own accord and we have to turn to religion. So one either begins in religion and is able to do philosophy, or one begins in philosophy, recognizes its ultimate insufficiency, and has to give up one's philosophizing for the sake of religiousness. And so with respect to your question about what the other option would be, that I think Tanabe's answer is finally that the alternative is to see philosophy through all the way to its inevitable failure. And it might be, I think it might be more like a kind of a recognition of radical finitude, that the human ego is capable only of a kind of frail usage of reason, and it basically either gives itself up from the very beginning to a kind of belief in some sort of Hegelian totality, right, or a kind of belief in being, or one begins from true philosophy, which is beginning from one's finite humanity, and recognizes then that philosophy inevitably fails, and one must then give oneself over to something other, like grace, essentially something like grace. So the relationship between the two things is very, very complex, but it's interesting that everything turns on the relationship between the starting point of philosophy and the relationship between philosophy and religion, and that in both thinkers, this kind of theoretical problem about beginnings ultimately gets expressed in terms of the question of praxis, right, or historical action.
Thank you. I just want to say one, just a line. I need to know more, but I'll check Tanabe's criticism more precisely. But it's just sometimes mind-boggling to me as to what's the philosophical sin exactly of Plotinus, given that he did claim that he did claim that the one is ungenerated. He didn't claim it's generated. So on that account, the comparability of the one and absolute nothingness is quite possible.
If I hear you right, you're saying that it doesn't make sense to call Nishida.
I'm not saying it doesn't make sense. I'm just trying to understand the culpability of that Tanabe is trying to identify exactly. I mean, the religiosity of Plotinus aside, or rather his mysticism, which is there. On Plotinus' own terms, he's incapable of. I'm sorry, I work on Plotinus. He did work. I worked on Plotinus. Plotinus is incapable in the sense of in this sense of philosophical insufficiency. All the more so because the idea of the one is religious, not philosophical. So it starts as a religious point. The one in Plotinus is a different name of God. He did make this as an original move. Nobody else did this before Plotinus, right? So so given that it's a religious, foremost religious concept, I'm just trying to understand Tanabe's criticism, but I do need to know more about the Japanese context, I guess. Yeah. Thank you.
And this would be a wonderful opportunity. I'm sure that some of you present here understand the subtleties of Tanabe's criticism much better than I do. I'd love to hear from any of you who could clarify at this point, because this is something that I have questions about as well. In what sense exactly is Tanabe accusing Nishida of sneaking being in through the back door? That I guess that's how I sort of understand it, that he uses the language of absolute nothingness, but what he's really talking about is a kind of plenum, a kind of being, so from which the logic would be emanation rather than dialectics.
There's one more question, Yuchen-san. I don't know if Yuchen is listening. Go ahead.
Okay. My question again, it's not very complicated, but it may be a little bit long. If I recall correctly, in post-continental philosophy, John Mullerkey claimed that among Michel Henry, Alain Badiou, François Laruelle, and Gilles Deleuze, only Deleuze is virtualist, and the rest are actualist. But such classification sounds a little bit weird for me. So I'm wondering if I can assume that, contrary to Badiou, who is still fascinated with the binary opposition of one-many, and that was exactly why he wanted present a philosophy of pure multiplicity, which from his point of view, Deleuze failed to give us all the binary opposition of virtue actual or Platonic or non-Platonic. I feel like that Laruelle is from the very start indifferent to such kind of binary opposition. So if I can say that Laruelle is from the very start out of such kind of Deleuze Badiou or Nishida Tanabe debates.
Yes, I thank you for elaborating that, because I think that that's exactly the line that I would like to try to develop, is that the problem of intra-philosophical debates does not need to be one that is constitutive of philosophy. And that's why I'm not at all critical of Higaki's reading of Nishida. I think it's a wonderful, positive reading. It's very, very interesting. Shows deep similarities between Nishida and Deleuze and develops them in interesting ways. The only point that I want to contest is the element of his argument that suggests not only that historically, right, or factually, Tanabe led to this kind of shift in Nishida's thinking, but I think Higaki wants to say that Tanabe's criticism, because it had philosophical hold, because it had philosophical purchase, in a sense, forced Nishida to this Deleuzian point of view. In other words, he had to give up the logic of Basho because only a kind of Deleuzian philosophy of difference would allow him to escape this kind of contemplation or emanationism. And that's where I would say, well, even if Nishida himself did make that shift, that doesn't mean that the kind of reasoning, the kind of intra-philosophical contestation that led to that shift is valid. I think the logic of Basho, on its own terms, has a kind of consistency and interest and usefulness, utility, right? That we can employ that in its own mode without having to say, well, because it has a certain philosophical form that is overcome by Deleuzian difference, we should leave it behind, right? That it's a way station to the true philosophy of life that Nishida gets at the end. I'm not sure if that addressed your question, or if
Nishida has to be Deleuzian for Tanabe, just like Deleuze has to be a philosophy of one for Badiou, so that he could be a philosopher of many.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good. Yeah, Jordan, I'll leave it up to you if you want to shut things down, or if you had maybe wanted to announce anything about tomorrow. I'm not sure.
So I think we should wrap things up. Yeah, we've been at it for more than an hour now, and Professor Gangle must be really tired, I guess. So we'll pick all this up tomorrow. We have 3 more presenters in the morning, and then we have a round table where all the presenters will join and in a discussion, in an open discussion. And of course, we'll see if possible, we'll open that round table to questions from the audience as well. I would like to thank you all for your attendance and support. Today, just like yesterday, has been really great. And I think tomorrow we'll have one more round of debate and discussion. And I really wish we had more time to address questions and comments from the chat, and to have more time for Q&A. But unfortunately, we're working in 3 different time zones, and people are in different places around the world, morning, noon, and evening. And in order to prepare for the final round tomorrow, I think we should bring this session to an end. So Rocco, would you like to add anything? I guess for me, that's all for today.
No, just, yeah, thanks so much to all of you for bearing with the Zoom format and listening to the talk. It's wonderful to have you all here. Thanks.
And I would like to really give thanks to François Schmidt and François Laruelle, who actually was present and was looking at our presentations. And I think that was really great. Hopefully we'll get some feedback as well. So looking forward to that if possible. So hope to see you tomorrow again, Françoise. Demain aussi, si vous pouvez, j'espère que vous allez revenir et participer comme aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup. Thank you all. So see you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.